Well, another Lord of the Rings adaptation featuring a female lead just dropped, so this should be fun.
Hold on to your butts.
I didn't expect a lot from this movie, to be honest. For one thing, because I just don't expect a lot out of any given piece of media these days. I have been brutally disappointed far too often. Looking at you, Obi-Wan Kenobi show. But for another thing, because I saw the trailer, which really played up Hera as yet another, I'm the best at everything, why are you holding me back, girl boss, and I'm sick of those. I was hoping Hollywood had finally gotten over that trope. And, well, War of the Rohirrim kind of did. At the very least, it did not lean into that regrettable trope nearly as hard as I feared it would. Hera, the daughter of King Helm Hammerhand, is described in the opening moments of the movie as headstrong, wild, and free, which is never a good start. Not necessarily because those are qualities I do not want to see in a character, though. Plenty of heroes start out living in their own little world, enjoying their own little pleasures and freedoms, before being thrust into responsibility and being forced to mature and grow. Rather, this isn't a good start because you are telling me about this character rather than letting me see for myself. And that line is a great example of the two measures by which I evaluate a story's worth. 1. Are the story's themes, messages, philosophies, and morals good, true, and beautiful? 2. Is the story told well? You have to answer affirmatively on both in order to have a truly good film. Does The War of the Rohirrim have both? Does it have either? Not really. Let's start with theme, which tends to be shown through the journey of the characters. Aang's journey, as I alluded to a moment ago, is one of learning to accept the weight of a responsibility that he would rather not take on. Displayed by that character arc is a philosophy that tells us that we cannot fully control our lot in life, that we are going to experience hardships and burdens for which we did not ask, and that all we can do is choose what to do now. If that sounds familiar, that would be because the same theme is present in Frodo's journey, taking on an unimaginably heavy burden and embarking on an impossible task, and ultimately returning home greatly changed by the ordeal. Welcome to Monomyth. The most impactful theme that I can extract from this film is the enduring power of hope, but no one ever really despairs in the movie. That movement from despair to hope, as experienced in such moving fashion by characters such as Theoden and Éowyn, isn't really present, at least not long enough to leave an impact on me. So, does the headstrong, wild, and free Hera demonstrate any themes throughout her character arc? Not really. Hera is hopeful, yes, but her struggle with despair is at most fleeting and forgettable. Without spoiling any specifics, the character we get at the end of the movie is pretty much the same character we are told about at the beginning of the movie, which isn't ideal. Hera goes through a lot of stuff during this movie, and she comes out the other side practically unchanged, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Established, mature paragons of virtue can absolutely enter a conflict and emerge from it just as awesome as they were before. But that's not really Hera. Not because she's obnoxious or self-absorbed, but because the most characterization she receives is from the narrator, and thus is rather flat and bland. A criticism which could apply to almost every character in this movie, by the way. For example, Hera and Wolf, the story's antagonist, talk about how they were inseparable at childhood. I'm not sure how that was possible considering she lived at Edoras and he lived by the river Adorn, but whatever. Anyway, that's literally all the shared backstory they get. There's one very brief flashback of them together in childhood, and it does little to tell us anything about their pre-existing relationship. Without any extra depth, the motivation of Wolf doesn't really have any richness or color to it. And on the whole, as a villain, Wolf fails. His basic motivation of vengeance makes sense enough, but man, is he boring.
You're just plain boring.
His every word is utterly predictable, except for one time when he acts completely out of character, so the plot can move forward. I wish I had more to say about this character, but I just don't. He's an antagonist who exists to antagonize. He doesn't really want to rule in the movie either. In the book, or rather the appendix, Wolf takes over Edoras and proclaims himself king after Helm was driven back to the Hornburg. Wolf does that briefly in the movie, and then goes to the Hornburg, soon to be known as Helm's Deep, and sits outside waiting for his chance at revenge against the woman who spurned him, because everything in this movie apparently just revolves around Hera. The film really seems like it was written entirely focusing on Hera and how other characters would react and relate to her, which is really really tricky to pull off, since it often saps other characters of their own agency or depth, and that's absolutely the case here, unfortunately. I felt like I was viewing every other character explicitly and exclusively through the lens of how do they relate to Hera. As she's the main character, you need to have that lens, but it should not be the only one. A fact that isn't helped by Hera just being uninteresting. She's got some good traits. She is hopeful. She loves her family and her country and is willing to sacrifice for them. She also isn't an unrealistically talented warrior who exists to show up all the stupid men. She clearly knows her strengths and weaknesses and plays to them. And she does in fact need help in several situations. But her character just doesn't go much deeper than that. And like I said, this complaint does not only apply to Hera and Wolf. All the other characters were quite shallow as well. Her brothers do some surface level heroic deeds, but they aren't given much screen time and have very little characterization, so I just didn't really care. I hardly knew them. Helm gets some more depth, and even a bit of an arc, though. That arc is learning that he should trust Hera, who is right about everything, but not for any particular reason. Hera is never shown to be particularly wise or possessing particularly keen judgment. Helm has no reason to trust Hera when it comes to decisions regarding war and battle, but she is right because the script says she is. In that sense, she resembles in some part the more obnoxious female leads in recent years. But at the same time, I do have to give the movie credit for writing Hera as a loving daughter and sister. She doesn't lord it over Helm that she was right and he was wrong. They were both basically just guessing anyway. She simply goes and does her duty as best she can. Hera doesn't take charge because she wants to prove how much better than all the men she is. She takes charge because someone needs to step up and lead their people in a time of crisis, and quite frankly, no one else is available. Which is, according to the movie, the reason the Shield Maidens exist. They are the women who took up arms when all the men had been killed in battle. And now that order of women is considered obsolete by King Helm, but there's still one plucky old Shield Maiden left to show Hera their ways, all of which felt unnecessary. I'm sure someone thought they were making some very brave social point by writing that into the plot, and lots of other people will take issues with it, I'm sure, but I just found it uninteresting. There's another character who I won't really talk about right now, who I also felt existed purely due to a certain visual the director wanted, a visual which might have some vague and vapid social statement behind it, and was in the end just more wasted screen time. But let's talk about those visuals and the other technical elements of the movie. Was this style of animation the best way to tell this story? I just did a video about how animation is not inferior to live action, so you know I'm not remotely biased against the medium, but I have no real strong feelings regarding this movie's art style. Like most of the rest of it, it was fine, if unimpressive, until I noticed its flaws, such as when the animators didn't bother putting features on the faces of characters in the distance, but who really weren't far enough away to justify their now completely blank faces. What annoyed me the most about the visuals was not the animation style, however, but the times when they blatantly ripped off Peter Jackson's films. War of the Rohirrim did this a lot, unfortunately, and that is one thing that really gets on my nerves. In this age of endless reboots, remakes, and the oxymoronic reimaginings, I just want stories to stop all that and be their own. Stop trying to trick consumers into liking them because they managed to evoke fond memories of a prior, much better story. One scene in particular drove me insane in this movie because they tried so hard to imitate one of the best scenes from Peter Jackson's movies, and they failed to do so in spectacular fashion. Again, I'm not going to go into detail, but suffice it to say that the battle scenes in this movie are very, very bad. I suspect that's largely because 80% of them got left on the cutting room floor. The one to which I'm referring jumps here and there with very little logical flow, and the action itself lacks any real weight or impact. You absolutely do not feel the battle. Perhaps I'll do a scene comparison once War of the Rohirrim is out of theaters. You don't get a good sense for who is winning or losing or why they're winning or losing. People simply end up where they need to be to move the story forward. Like I said, I think that largely comes down to the editing. I suspect this scene was easily twice as long before it got cut down. Which is odd, because the title of the movie is War of the Rohirrim, but the actual war is barely shown. In the appendix, Rohan is invaded from the east. It's not specified by whom exactly. And then Wolf sees his chance and attacks from Dunlin in the west, allied with the enemies of Gondor. That, in and of itself, is a great plot hook. A kingdom suddenly finding itself warring on two fronts, having to decide where to commit troops. A king having to choose where his presence will be most needed. But yeah, it's just not there in the movie. A threat from the east is mentioned in passing, I think, and then disappears into nothingness. Or maybe it gets incorporated into the Dunlendings, I don't exactly remember. Either way, the titular war is hardly a war at all. The scale of the conflict shown in the movie does not remotely match what's supposedly happening. If you read the few paragraphs that describe this period in Rohan's history, you can easily envision how it would be made into a movie. But for some reason, they chose to take the most mundane part of that story, Rohan's people sheltering in Helm's Deep, and make it dominate the film's runtime. We spend more time with random side characters who are really just plot MacGuffins than we do establishing the legend of Helm Hammerhand himself. And while I did enjoy Helm overall, I have one more complaint about him. In the original story, he basically sucker punches Freka, which ends up killing the guy. That doesn't happen here. The one punch thing does, but it's a much more honorable and fair fight, which takes away from the character. Helm Hammerhand is not supposed to be a paragon of virtue. What little there is written of him shows Helm to be a rash, prone to anger, and even brutal man. He's a badass, yeah, but he's also a little bit crazy, and is driven by his passion to do some rather crazy stuff. Tolkien's good guys, contrary to what you might hear, are not all Boy Scouts akin to Sam and Aragorn. Evil is evil and good is good in Tolkien's world, of course, but men are still men. They are broken, flawed, and prone to every vice imaginable. I didn't appreciate that the film, whitewashed Helm. Not in the racial sense, obviously, but rather in the quality of his character. His story would be far more compelling if it were more akin to a cautionary tale. If it followed his descent into madness and brutality following the loss of his sons and the seemingly hopeless plight of his people. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. I was supposed to talk about the actual elements of the movie itself, that is, how well the story was made. Let's continue with the dialogue. It's basic.
You're basic.
It is what it needs to be to move the plot forward. It lacks almost all flavor and does very little to enrich the characters who speak the lines. Most of the time, characters are consistent in their words and actions, though they don't have enough depth for anything they say or do to be out of character 95% of the time. What about consistency in the plot, then? Well, I don't want to spoil anything, but there's a given scene in the movie that only happens because certain people didn't do a very obvious thing, except that they do that very obvious thing. In fact, they were planning on it all along. They just waited until the pre-planned drama had unfolded before doing the very obvious thing that would have rendered said drama completely unnecessary and saved a lot of lives in the process. And there were a couple other moments of similar ilk, where something would happen and just so perfectly be the exact thing needed to move the story forward and achieve the director's vision. Specifically, Hera becoming the temporary leader of her people, which happens through just sheer coincidence. The original plot was all laid out for these writers. All they had to do was fill in the details, but they went and changed things dramatically and did so through a few well-placed contrivances. Now, look. I'm biggest into character writing. It's my thing. It's what I most enjoy analyzing. It's what I'm most critical of. None of the characters in War of the Rohirrim struck much of a chord at all with me. And so I found the story uninspired and dull. If character arcs are not your most important aspect of a story, you might very well thoroughly enjoy this film. Or maybe they are, and you still enjoy it. I'm not gonna ever tell you to not watch something just because I don't like it. Stories speak to us in different ways, and if you find War of the Rohirrim to be inspiring or edifying, that's fantastic. Personally, I found it morally shallow and too focused on the freedom of self-determination for its main character. I wanted Hera to have more of a hero's journey, to be changed by the really traumatic events that she witnessed, but that's just not what happens. The last words we hear from the narrator are that Hera is headstrong, wild, and free. Literally the same words used at the beginning of the movie. Typically, I have to decide for myself whether or not a character has no growth, but here the writers decided to tell me that for themselves.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
I really wanted to like this movie. Maybe the constant member berries made me overly critical, but I really just don't think this is a well-written film. Nor do I think it has a worthwhile message. The movie just seemed to want to show me Hera being Hera, and not much else. She could have been a lot worse, and honestly, I was expecting her to be a lot worse, but I still got next to nothing out of her journey. And according to the film itself, neither did she.